January 1941. Tuskegee, Alabama. The letter from the United States Army Air Corps arrived at the homes of young black men across America with the same words that letters arrived at the homes of white men: an invitation to serve their country, to become military pilots, to join the most prestigious and technologically demanding branch of the armed forces in the world. The difference was what happened when they arrived to accept that invitation. They were sent to Tuskegee, Alabama, to a training program that the Army Air Corps had created not because it believed black men could become combat pilots, but because political pressure from civil rights organizations and the black press had made it impossible to simply refuse them outright. The Tuskegee experiment, as Army officials privately called it, was designed to train a small number of black pilots in a segregated facility, send them to a combat theater where they could be evaluated, and use the results of that evaluation to justify whatever policy the Army had already decided to implement. The men who arrived at Tuskegee Airfield in 1941 understood exactly what was happening. They understood that they were not being given an opportunity so much as a test, and that the test had been designed by people who expected them to fail. They understood that the entire apparatus of military segregation, of separate facilities and separate units and separate standards applied selectively to justify predetermined conclusions, was arrayed against them. They understood all of this, and they reported for training anyway. They were going to prove every assumption wrong. Not with protests or speeches or legal challenges, though all of those had their place and their importance. They were going to prove every assumption wrong by being the best pilots in the United States Army Air Forces, by flying better than the white pilots who had never been told they might not be capable, by fighting harder than an institution that had questioned their courage before they had fired a single shot in anger, by coming home with records that nobody could explain away and nobody could ignore. What followed over the next 4 years was one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of American military aviation, a story of men who carried the weight of an entire people's aspirations on their shoulders into combat over North Africa and Sicily and Italy and the skies of Germany itself, men who flew with a chip on their shoulder the size of a continent and who proved, mission by mission and kill by kill, that the assumptions that had been made about them were not just wrong but, embarrassingly, undeniably, historically wrong. To understand what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished, you have to understand what they were fighting against before they ever climbed into a cockpit. The United States military in 1941 was as thoroughly segregated as any institution in American society. The Army maintained separate units for black and white soldiers, separate facilities, separate promotion tracks, and an informal but rigorously enforced ceiling on the ranks that black officers could achieve and the responsibilities they could be given. The Navy accepted black men only as messmen, servants to white officers. The Marine Corps did not accept black men at all until 1942. The Army Air Corps was even more restrictive than the ground forces. Flying was considered a technical and cognitive challenge of the highest order, requiring the kind of spatial reasoning, quick decision-making, and mechanical aptitude that Army officials, applying the racial theories that were considered scientifically respectable in the 1940s, believed black men did not possess. The resistance to training black pilots was not merely bureaucratic inertia. It was ideological conviction, held by senior officers who believed sincerely that they were being asked to do something that could not succeed. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, told the Army's Chief of Staff in 1940 that the use of colored troops in the Air Corps in other than service capacities is inadvisable. He was not unusual in this view. He was representative of it. The political pressure that created the Tuskegee program came from multiple directions simultaneously. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in the country, had been campaigning for black participation in military aviation since the late 1930s. The NAACP and other civil rights organizations had been lobbying Congress and the Roosevelt administration. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had become a powerful advocate for civil rights within the administration, had visited Tuskegee Institute in 1941 and had famously flown with Chief Civilian Flight Instructor Charles Anderson in a small plane, a gesture that signaled presidential attention to the program. The result was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely. The Army Air Corps would train black pilots at Tuskegee Airfield in Alabama, in a facility completely separate from the training programs used for white pilots, under the command of black officers where possible and white officers where the Army deemed it necessary. The graduates would form segregated combat units that would be evaluated in combat, and whose performance would determine future policy. The first class of Tuskegee cadets began flight training in July 1941. They were 5 men, selected from a larger group of candidates who had passed the same written and physical tests required of white aviation cadets. The washout rate was expected to be high because the washout rate for any pilot training program was high and because the Army expected black candidates to perform below the level of white ones. 3 of the 5 completed the program. In March 1942, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the first black general in the United States Army, led those 3 pilots across the stage at Tuskegee to receive their wings. They were the first black military aviators in American history. Davis was 30 years old, a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years at the academy in an environment of almost complete social ostracism. His white classmates had refused to speak to him, to eat with him, to acknowledge his existence except when military protocol required it. He had graduated in the top quarter of his class in 4 years of silence. He had emerged from that silence with a discipline and a determination that would define his command of the Tuskegee units in combat. The 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first unit formed from Tuskegee graduates, arrived in North Africa in April 1943. Their commander was Benjamin Davis. Their aircraft were P-40 Warhawks, a capable but not exceptional fighter that was being phased out of first-line service in favor of newer designs. They were assigned to provide air support for ground operations in Tunisia, a mission that provided combat experience but limited opportunities for the air-to-air combat that would demonstrate their capabilities as fighter pilots. The initial combat reports from the 99th were positive but not spectacular. The squadron flew its missions, performed its duties, and began the process of accumulating the combat experience that separates training from war. But the reports were being read by officers who were looking for evidence that confirmed their existing beliefs, and the absence of dramatic success in the early months was interpreted by some as evidence that the experiment was failing. In September 1943, Colonel William Momyer, the white commander of the fighter group to which the 99th was attached, submitted a report to higher headquarters recommending that the 99th be removed from combat operations and reassigned to a training or coastal patrol role. His report cited the squadron's performance as below the standard of white units and suggested that black pilots lacked the aggressive spirit required for air-to-air combat. Mommyer's report was taken seriously at Army Air Forces headquarters. A board of officers reviewed the 99th's performance statistics and prepared a report that recommended removing black pilots from combat aviation entirely. The Tuskegee experiment, in the Army's assessment, had produced the result that had been expected. The board's report reached Washington just as the 99th was proving it wrong. On January 27, 1944, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was assigned to provide air cover for the Allied landings at Anzio, Italy. German fighters, the Focke-Wulf 190s that were among the most capable aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory, appeared over the beachhead in force. What happened in the air over Anzio on January 27th and 28th was the refutation of every assumption that had been made about black pilots since the Army Air Corps had first been asked to train them. The pilots of the 99th engaged the German fighters with an aggression and a precision that destroyed 12 enemy aircraft in 2 days. 12 kills in 2 days was extraordinary performance by any standard, equal to or exceeding the performance of any white fighter squadron in the theater during the same period. The officers at Army Air Forces headquarters who had been preparing to shut down the Tuskegee program received the combat reports from Anzio and put their report in a drawer. The success at Anzio coincided with the expansion of the Tuskegee program into a larger formation. The 332nd Fighter Group was formed from multiple Tuskegee trained squadrons, with Davis in command, and equipped first with P-39 Airacobras and then with P-47 Thunderbolts and finally with P-51 Mustangs. The red-painted tails that the 332nd applied to their aircraft gave them their most famous nickname, the Red Tails, a marking that bomber crews learned to recognize and to welcome. The assignment that would define the 332ND's reputation came in June 1944, when the group was assigned to provide long-range escort for heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force attacking targets deep inside Germany and German-occupied Europe. Escort duty was the most demanding and in some ways the most important mission available to fighter pilots in the European theater. Bombers that flew without fighter escort into heavily defended German airspace suffered catastrophic losses. Bombers that flew with effective fighter escort survived. The standard practice among many escort fighter groups was to leave the bombers when German fighters appeared and engage in the aggressive individual combat that produced personal kills and combat records. The bomber crews called this practice being abandoned, and the consequences in bomber losses were severe. German fighter pilots who understood American escort tactics would wait for the fighter escort to break away in pursuit of decoys and then fall on the unprotected bombers. Davis gave the 332nd a standing order that departed from standard practice. His pilots would not leave the bombers. The mission was to protect the bombers and the men inside them, and that mission would be executed regardless of the opportunities for individual glory that presented themselves. Davis understood that protecting the bombers required discipline that was harder to maintain than the aggressive individualism that fighter pilots were trained toward, and he demanded that discipline from his pilots. The results of that discipline were recorded in the mission logs of the 15th Air Force. In more than 200 escort missions flown by the 332nd Fighter Group, not a single bomber under their escort was lost to enemy fighter attack. Not one. While other escort groups returned from missions having lost bombers to German fighters who had exploited gaps in the fighter screen, the 332nd brought its bombers home. The bomber crews of the 15th Air Force knew what the red tails meant. When they saw the 332nd forming up to escort them, they knew they were coming home. Requests were submitted through official channels for specific assignment of the 332nd as escort for particularly dangerous missions. White bomber crews, men who had grown up in an America where the racial hierarchy was as natural and unremarkable as the weather, asked specifically for the black fighter pilots to protect them because the black fighter pilots were the best at the job. The individual combat records of 332nd pilots added to the collective achievement. Lieutenant Lee Archer shot down 4 German aircraft, missing the 5th kill that would have made him an ace by the width of a margin that combat does not always provide. Captain Wendell Pruitt and Lieutenant Gwynne Pierson conducted one of the most remarkable attacks of the Italian campaign when they sank a German destroyer with their .50 caliber machine guns, the only recorded instance of fighter aircraft destroying a destroyer in the European theater. Captain Joseph Ellsbury shot down 3 German aircraft in a single mission and was recommended for the Medal of Honor, a recommendation that was downgraded. The downgrading of the Medal of Honor recommendation for Ellsbury was representative of a pattern that ran through the 332ND's combat record. Decorations that would have been approved automatically for white pilots required additional justification when submitted for black pilots. Promotions moved more slowly. Recognition came later and with more resistance. The institutional barriers that had been present at the beginning of the Tuskegee program did not disappear because the program had succeeded. They persisted in the form of deliberate under-recognition that would not be fully addressed until decades after the war ended. The mission of June 9, 1944 became the most celebrated single operation in the 332ND's history. The target was the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg, Germany, one of the most heavily defended targets in the German industrial complex, deep inside enemy territory and protected by the best fighter units the Luftwaffe could assemble. The 332nd was assigned to escort the bombers for the entire round trip. German fighters rose to meet them in force. The engagement that followed was the largest air battle in the 332ND's history, a running fight over hundreds of miles of European sky that tested everything Davis had demanded of his pilots. When it was over, the 332nd had shot down 5 German aircraft and the bombers had arrived over their target and returned to base without a loss to enemy fighters. Among the German pilots who encountered the 332nd over the skies of Europe, the red-tailed Mustangs acquired a reputation that was passed through fighter units in the same way that information about capable opponents always passes through military organizations, with a mixture of professional respect and tactical concern. German pilots who had dismissed American black aviators on the basis of the same racial theories that American military officials had applied were discovering that the theories had no relationship to the reality they were encountering above 30,000 feet. The war did not suspend racism at altitude, but it did make racism irrelevant in the specific sense that mattered most to the German pilots who encountered the 332nd. An aircraft flown by a Tuskegee Airman fired its guns with the same lethal effect as an aircraft flown by anyone else. The P-51 Mustang with the red tail performed exactly as well as the P-51 Mustang without it. The pilot who had trained at Tuskegee and flown 200 missions over Europe had skills that training and experience had produced regardless of the institutional barriers that had been placed in his path. The 332nd Fighter Group flew its last combat mission in April 1945 as the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion. The group's combat record included 15,533 individual sorties, 1,578 combat missions, 112 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and the destruction of numerous ground targets including trains, trucks, gun emplacements, and the destroyer that Pruitt and Pierson had sunk with machine gun fire. The human cost was 66 pilots killed in action and 32 captured. The men who were captured experienced the particular surrealism of being black American prisoners of war in Nazi Germany, imprisoned by a regime whose racial ideology was explicit and systematic while representing a country whose racial hierarchy was implicit but equally pervasive. Some reported that their treatment as prisoners was comparable to the treatment of white American prisoners. Others reported specific incidents of brutality directed at their race. All of them survived to come home. The homecoming was not what it should have been. The men of the 332nd returned to an America where the military they had served remained segregated, where the states they came from maintained legal racial separation in schools, restaurants, transportation, and housing, where the service they had rendered was acknowledged in the specific transactions of official recognition but had not yet changed the broader structure of the society they had defended. The changes would come. The military desegregation order came from President Truman in 1948, 3 years after the war ended. The Civil Rights Act came in 1964, nearly 2 decades after the 332nd flew its last mission over Europe. The full acknowledgment of what the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished, including the Congressional Gold Medal awarded to surviving members of the program in 2007, came 62 years after the war's end. The men who received those medals in 2007 were in their 80s and 90s. They had lived long enough to receive from their country a recognition that their country had withheld for 6 decades, an acknowledgement that what they had done mattered and that the barriers that had been placed in their path had been unjust, and that history would record them as the men they had actually been rather than the men that the racial theories of the 1940s had insisted they must be. General Benjamin Davis Jr., who had endured 4 years of silence at West Point and had commanded the 332nd through its greatest achievements, lived to see his father's rank of Brigadier General surpassed when he himself was promoted to 4-star General, the first black officer to hold that rank in the United States Air Force. He received his 4th star in 1998 in a ceremony at the White House. He was 85 years old. The Tuskegee Airmen did not just fight for their country. They fought for what their country claimed to be but had not yet become, a nation where the content of a man's character and the quality of his performance determine his standing rather than the color of his skin. They fought for that idea in the skies over North Africa and Sicily and Italy and Germany, mission by mission and kill by kill, demonstrating through the accumulated evidence of their performance that the idea was true even when the country that claimed to believe it was not yet living by it. They were the best escort pilots in the 15th Air Force. They brought their bombers home when other escorts did not. They proved every assumption wrong in the most direct way possible, by flying better than the people who doubted them, by fighting harder than the institution that had questioned their courage, by coming home with records that 60 years later, when the full story was finally told to the full nation, made everyone who heard them proud. Not just proud of the Tuskegee Airmen. Proud to be American. Proud that the country that had placed those barriers in their path had also produced the men who refused to be stopped by them. Proud that the story of American military excellence included this story, these men, these red tails over the skies of Europe. They were the best. They proved it every day they flew. The red tails never lost a bomber. That is the whole story. That is everything that needs to be said. They never lost a bomber.